speaking to us virtually, Chief Policy Advisor, Tech, Peace and Security from the Permanent Mission of Denmark to the United Nations, Sara Rendtorff Smith.
Good evening from New York.
Well, good evening to New York. We're delighted to have you up, and sorry about that technical flaw. You never know what's going to happen with these virtual conferences. So over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for your patience. So, Your Highnesses, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm speaking, as I mentioned, from New York. Masa al khair wa salam alaikum. I've been posed the unique challenge to speak last via this virtual connection, and also on the complex issue of AI policy cooperation from a multilateral perspective. And as mentioned, I'll do this from this vantage point here at the United Nations in New York. I've been posted at the UN for nearly a decade, and I'm now a diplomat at the Danish Foreign Service. Unfortunately, I was unable to travel, but it all ties together because we're looking ahead for next week when world leaders descend on New York for high-level week at the General Assembly. And this really helped frame my talk today. Which I shall say for the record is in my own personal capacity, and so it doesn't reflect the official opinion of the government of Denmark. And I've decided to title my talk Digital Disruption of Multilateralism ? And as you mentioned, we did hear from the tech envoy earlier, other great colleagues. So you've already received a bit of a primer on this issue. But I think just to take a step back, it's important to consider that at the backdrop of what we're seeing in digital and AI, multilateralism is currently under extreme pressure. And we're seeing this on the one hand, with rising geopolitical tensions that are jeopardizing the hard-won global agreements that we've made as member states, but also the UN's ability to respond to urgent crises. And we see deadlock in the Security Council, and we recently saw the inability of member states to agree on an outcome document of the 10th Review Conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So this is sort of the background. And then at the same time, here at the UN, it's apparent to everyone that the defining challenges of the 21st century, of which obviously new and emerging technologies is one, but also climate change, pandemics, these are all transnational in nature. And so we can, of course, only address these collectively. And so against this, I thought I would just hone in on two major parts in my talk today. And one is a question about if and sort of to what extent the emergence of AI has had an impact at all on multilateralism. Cliffhanger. And here I'll argue that in many ways, nothing has really changed. I'll get to this later, in the sense that the UN has managed to in some ways sort of absorb the reality of new and emerging technologies like AI into its conventional ways of working. You saw the tech envoy earlier, but we have other envoys in the UN that work on other really urgent challenges. Then at the same time, AI and other emerging technologies are also in some way exacerbating some of the challenges and points of criticism that were already faced by the UN as it is. And so this I hope to focus on at the very end before you all go home and reflect on today. So when looking out on the world from its vantage point on First Avenue here in New York, the UN, of course, is facing a drastically different world from what was the case in 1945 when it was founded. And some of these realities have already been mentioned by speakers today. We're seeing a rise in the use of lethal autonomous weapon systems in armed conflict by state and non-state actors alike. And that's a major question. That speaker before last talked about life and death questions. This is definitely one of those. There's the issue of dis and misinformation, and this is spreading rampantly. It's often enabled by social media algorithms, and it's been found to spark deadly violence, armed conflict, as was seen against the Rohingya in Myanmar. But we also find that peacekeepers deployed in already challenging environments like the Central African Republic and Mali suddenly have to deal with this new reality. Then finally, or one other aspect is sort of the complex and large-scale cyber attacks that are carried out also in the fog of war. We're seeing it currently in Ukraine, but again, this is also being targeted at the UN. So an organization has to grapple with this as well. On sort of the positive side, or where AI has enabled the UN, you could argue better implement its mandate. We see, UN taking advantages of AI technology to deliver humanitarian assistance via drones, for instance. And we've talked about climate change as another major challenge that we're all grappling with. And here, the UN, many of its organizations are using satellite data to enhance our understanding of climate change. And sort of what to do about that. So this is the new reality. And so I will argue that against this reality, two narratives are emerging. One is that everything has changed, right? Very convincing based on what I just described. But on the other, as I alluded to earlier, you could also argue that nothing really has changed. So I decided to measure up, see how these two arguments measured up. And if we look at sort of the nothing has changed argument, we can think of the UN in two ways. On the one hand, it constitutes a platform for member state negotiations. As a diplomat, I currently go over to the UN frequently to voice Denmark's views on a variety of issues and to adopt resolutions and so on. And then on the other hand, the UN obviously acts in the world and is extremely important in addressing some of these transnational and really urgent challenges that we're facing. So these are two ways we need to think of the UN. And so if we think about the former, the platform for interstate negotiations, we're really seeing that the UN or member states really in the UN are adopting resolutions in the General Assembly, in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, as they do on any other challenge. They also do this on AI and related issues. Similarly, we see member states negotiating treaties, conventions that spring from sort of behaviors and phenomena that are enabled by artificial intelligence. One example being cybercrime, where we just concluded a session last week. And then maybe sort of the most salient argument and one that I think a lot have convincingly argued is that both international human rights law and international humanitarian law is really has been agreed by member states to apply across the offline and online spheres. So we have frameworks in place that in a way can solve the challenges posed by AI. And then if we look again at the UN as an actor operating in the world, and we can understand this in some ways as an organization facing some of the similar challenges to local and national governments, just to link back to some of the discussions that we've heard earlier today. And here, as I mentioned earlier, obviously the UN has appointed a tech envoy, which is a very important step. This is an envoy on this specific issues. The UN has other envoys on other issues, and it follows in a way the initiative by member states to appoint tech ambassadors, cyber ambassadors, which is sort of a growing trend. And I must say one that Denmark started with our appointment of a tech ambassador years ago. Secondly, big data and the use of algorithms by conflict actors, as well as the emergence of powerful tech companies, has become just another factor that the UN on the ground takes into account in its situational awareness analysis. And then finally, if we look at AI, as I alluded to earlier as well, it is really serving as a critical enabler for implementing the UN's existing mandates across the three pillars that are development, human rights, peace and security, and humanitarian action related to this. And here, the International Telecommunications Union, ITU, actually publishes a really useful annual repository of all the activities that the UN does in the field of AI and with AI. So while this in some ways is a true depiction of the intersection of UN and AI, I will argue that it's not fully true that nothing has changed at the UN. In some ways, AI fundamentally challenges the organization, and this is actually in the areas that it has been challenged throughout. And there's some areas that I would recommend that the audience pays particular attention to, and it's very close to some of the things that have been mentioned earlier today. And I also hope that everyone here can be inspired to also put our collective efforts towards supporting and solving these issues or these focal areas, because it's really not enough that the Secretary General has published a data strategy and a strategy on new technologies, and this encourages the UN to make better use of data and artificial intelligence in support of data-driven decision making, as we're seeing in government as well. As previous speakers have really stressed, this increased use of data-driven decision-making comes with requirements for transparency and accountability, and this has already been, in a way, a challenge for the UN. It has sparked work on a human rights due diligence policy for technology, which the organization OHCHR, Leading on Human Rights, is spearheading. And we've heard already about the OECD AI principles. There's UNESCO's recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence that was also recently adopted. But just to say, this is really important work to follow, and something that fundamentally, in a way, will change how the organization works. And then a second issue is that if we actually successfully implement this and we get an organization that is more data-driven, enabled by AI, one can imagine the ability to better forecast and also prevent threats. And this is happening alongside sort of pre-existing and only sort of growing pressures from inside and outside the organization to do more in this area. So very exciting, but also something to keep an eye on. And I'll just like to mention one example, which is the initiatives such as the Famine Action Mechanism, which is the UN, World Bank, and Red Cross coming together with tech companies to use machine learning and AI to actually better forecast high-risk areas for famine. So as we look at the world today, obviously, where there's extreme pressures on particularly the global south in the area of food prices, this will be extremely important. And linked to this, not just understanding the problem, as others have mentioned, to be able to act, there's been this innovation of actually linking more predictable financing to this analysis so that it can get triggered early on and hopefully prevent disaster for a large number of populations. Then secondly, we're seeing in UN peacekeeping that protection of civilians have historically been a challenging mandate. And here it's similarly the ambition and hope, in a way, that data-driven decision-making can enable the UN to do better in terms of responding in a timely manner to threats to civilians. So again, another area to focus on is the forecasting ability of the UN that may dramatically alter the way the organization is able to act. If we look then on the side of member states and the UN as a platform for negotiations, I would argue there's sort of three areas in which things are changing fundamentally. And I've called those guidance, capacity, and partnerships. And as mentioned earlier, we've achieved consensus among member states that human rights law and humanitarian law applies online and offline. The High Commissioner for Human Rights has also made her voice heard to say that states should place moratoriums on the sale and use of artificial intelligence systems until adequate safeguards are put in place. And last year, as also mentioned by the tech envoy here, the SG, the Secretary General of the UN, published his vision for the future, for how to future-proof the UN and multilateralism. And this will include the development of a global digital compact. And that would, among other things, promote regulation of AI to ensure it's aligned with shared global values. And as the tech envoy mentioned, will be a subject of discussion at the Summit of the Future. So I think the hard task here, though, is now to define what the application of these legal frameworks actually means in practice. So translating that into practice. And we've seen a bit of work there, but there's definitely still more to be done. And the work, obviously, on lethal autonomous weapon systems is one good example, where there was a group of governmental experts coming together to try to indeed tackle this question. What does it mean when we apply international humanitarian law to autonomous weapon systems? So diplomats are hard at work trying to figure this out, but they can really only do this if they have the right skills and if they work in close consultation and partnership with non-governmental actors. And I appreciated how the panel earlier focused quite a bit of time on who needs to be consulted, who needs to be in the room, and when. And here, when we speak first to the question of skills or capacity, when we go to negotiate resolutions at the UN, it's not. Well, I shall say we need to have diplomats get a better skill set around technology. It's not sufficient to just have a single envoy or ambassador who's dedicated to this. This is really something that needs to be rolled out across, I would say, most functions in the diplomatic service. And then on the other side of the fence, an interesting development that hopefully will set a precedent is also that we see a need for large tech corporations also to better acquaint themselves and actively invest in the UN's work. And here Microsoft has in a way taken the lead by appointing a vice president for UN affairs in 2020, and also opening up a representation office here in the UN to deepen support to the UN's mission and work, as they call it. So both sides of the fence will need to get better acquainted and strengthen their capacity in working with each other. Then finally, the third dimension of the UN as a platform for interstate negotiations is partnerships. And again, if we want to be able to work successfully at the intersection of technology and multilateralism, it requires the meaningful engagement of non-governmental actors. This is being often referred to here as multi-stakeholderism, but the Secretary General has also taken the lead and is himself pushing his vision of a so-called networked multilateralism, which will be obviously extremely important. And here, unfortunately, as others have already underlined, we are unfortunately still a long way off, I think, from the meaningful inclusion of such non-governmental actors. This was illustrated by example by the latest round of negotiations on cybersecurity in the so-called open-ended working group, which concluded its work in 2021, and non-governmental actors were only included through the convening of multi-stakeholder sessions that were alongside the actual process. And as you can imagine, member states were not very present in those sessions. And so I think, just to conclude, if we look at this important aspect, this is exactly why events such as this summit, that I wish I myself could have been physically present at, but is the Global AI Summit is so extremely important. It brings together actors across government, tech sector, civil society, and academia, and allows us to deepen our mutual understanding and also spurs new ideas, new and innovative ideas for collaboration. So just grateful for this annual event, and hopefully together we can help address the many challenges outlined above, which, by the way, are also opportunities. Thank you.